Intrinsically, you know that this and this is just clickbait and jump scares, and you're looking for something with a little more substance to affirm the other reality that you know to be true, that ghosts actually are real. Welcome to your channel. This is the Moonlit Ghost, and you're watching the History of Ghosts Part 2. Today I'm sharing with you the story of an Egyptian man haunted by the ghost of his wife, the heartbreaking tale of Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu, and I'll do a little modern debunking as well. Like, is this really a water demon caught on camera? Stay tuned and find out. And you won't want to miss the end of this video where you get to find out what the afterlife is actually like for an ancient Sumerian. And unless you want to eat dust for the rest of eternity, you better like this video right now. To an ancient Egyptian, society consisted of 4 classes: the gods, the kings, the dead, and the living. Those alive in ancient Egypt were responsible for maintaining a certain value structure which seems appealing to our modern sensibility. Ma'at, which is harmony and balance in all things, pervaded the Egyptian mindset. It was particularly stressed for those who passed on, and if a person's Ku, that is their immortal soul, were to ever come back to haunt the living, it meant that there was something really wrong with their Mot. A troubled Ku whose Mot was out of kilter would often come back as a ghost. This was often the result of its body's improper burial or a lack of respect for the specified deceased person. Doesn't this sound familiar? This isn't too far removed from our modern experience. A ghost will haunt their murderer until justice is served, or they will come back and lead people to where their body is so their story can have a proper ending. We hear stories like this all the time, but what of when there doesn't appear to be a good reason for a ghost to come back? We get a story like this from ancient Egypt. At least that's what this Egyptian widower would have you think. He laments how the Ku of his wife was perpetually tormenting him, and aggressively so. When a ghost was being problematic, an Egyptian could go to the temple and with the aid of a priest help gain insights into what the troubled spirit needed to move on. But if this didn't work, and the ghost continued to haunt a living person, that person was instructed to write a letter to the deceased. And this is the position we find our widower in. In a tomb in the Middle Kingdom, we find this letter from our widower to his deceased wife. It reads,
"What wicked thing have I done to thee that I should have come to this evil pass? What have I done to thee? But what thou hast done to me is to have laid hands on me, although I had nothing wicked to thee. From the time I lived with thee as thy husband down to today, what have I done to thee that I need hide? When thou didst sicken of the illness which thou hadst, I caused a master physician to be fetched. I spent 8 months without eating and drinking like a man. I wept exceedingly together with my household in front of my street quarter. I gave linen clothes to wrap thee, and left no benefit undone that had to be performed for thee. And now, behold, I have spent 3 years alone without entering into a house, though it is not right that one like me should have to do it. This have I done for thy sake. But behold, thou dost not know good from evil."
The man is asking why his wife is haunting him, and she appears to be pretty upset. And he is listing all of the reasons why she shouldn't be. And then he goes on to explain that he's done everything right, even going so far as to say that he spent 3 years after her death not even going into a house, which in this context is a brothel. Although adding that he could if he wanted to because of his status. Nobody knows the resolution to this story. He could have been haunted for the rest of his life for all I know. And I'm no Egyptologist, but I am a human, and so are you, presumably. And so let me know what you think about this man's letter to his dead wife in the comments below. Alright, I originally saw this one on Nuke's Top 5, one of his recent videos. It's from a channel called RC Fun TV 2 or 11, I'm not sure, and they seem to catch the spirit of a man who in this river, sitting on the bank. Then suddenly, he mysteriously disappears into the water. The horror of this backstory is apparent. Let's watch the video. My initial impression of this is that it seems like an amazing catch on video, and I want to believe this one. Isolated, it's got all of the right things. It's got a good backstory, it's compelling, and it has a semi-disfigured entity, clear enough to see, but obscured enough to be creepy. However, upon further inspection, this channel is littered with things like this. Cheap edits and over-the-top acting force me to assume that this river ghost is nothing more than antics for views. This is not a real ghost caught on camera. Sorry, Nuke. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And seriously, wouldn't you just rather hear a ghost story from ancient Sumeria anyway? The Epic of Gilgamesh, first written down around 2000 BC, is truly epic. But you wouldn't call it a ghost story. That said, I'm trying to include anything in this series where we find a spirit coming back from the dead or the underworld, and there is an interesting twist at the end of this story. You see, the Epic of Gilgamesh is contained mostly on 11 tablets, and there isn't really a ghost story in those 11 tablets unless you considered the vanquishing of a demon named Humbaba a ghost story, but generally this is a story of adventure, loss, grief, and finally coming to terms with what you have here and now in this life. However, at some point there was a 12th tablet added to the main storyline, and it doesn't really fit at the end very well, but it's kind of like the Dragon Ball Z movies with like Broly. It's awesome, but it doesn't really fit into the chronological timeline of the show. Anyway, scholars agree that the 12th tablet is actually much older than the bulk of the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, and someone just kind of slipped that 12th tablet in there at some point. But very interestingly, it's here that we get kind of a ghost story, but this ghost story is a little different. Before we get there, here's a little overview. I'm not going to summarize the whole story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but 4,000-year-old, spoiler alert, this one's on you. After Gilgamesh and his best friend Enkidu kill a giant bull sent by the gods are a little infuriated, and they determine that Enkidu must die. Enkidu becomes very sick, and days later, he dies. And the god king himself, Gilgamesh, is utterly heartbroken. He is filled with grief. He's so distraught that he embarks on an epic journey to find eternal life. Eventually he finds Utnapishtim, who is essentially the Mesopotamians' version of Noah. Utnapishtim explains the flood story and how the gods deemed him worthy of eternal life, but that Gilgamesh wasn't worthy of it. Utnapishtim sends Gilgamesh away dismayed, but allows him to find a plant that brings eternal youth. Unfortunately, a snake steals the plant, sheds its skin, and becomes youthful again, and Gilgamesh is left to mourn all that he has lost. But then he learns to appreciate the beauty that he has around him. And that's the end of the story. Well, that's the end of the 11th tablet. Then on the 12th and final tablet, we find Gilgamesh in distress, in a seemingly different story arc, because Enkidu is now alive? Well, maybe not, because some scholars suggest that this is actually the ghost of Enkidu, which is why he is able to do what he does on this tablet. The story goes like this. Enki, god of wisdom, is sailing his boat through a terrible storm. The storm uproots a halub tree, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war and fertility, then takes the tree to the city of Uruk to plant. She hopes to turn it into furniture when it matures. She plants it and it grows. But unfortunately, a demon takes up residence in the tree, and Inanna asks her brother Gilgamesh to deal with the demon, and he does fairly easily. Then he cuts down the tree for her so she can make her furniture. Gilgamesh fashions the Elig and the Echidna, two objects which scholars aren't sure what they really are, but it has been suggested that they are a war drum and the drumsticks. And Gilgamesh loves his drum and plays it all day and all night, like a teenager playing his drums in the garage at all hours of the night. And the women of the city get a little tired of Gilgamesh playing the drums. They complain to the gods, and the gods then cause Gilgamesh to accidentally drop his drums and drumsticks. They slip out of his hands, and he, like I said, accidentally drops them into the netherworld. Oops. Imagine if you could accidentally drop your car keys into the afterlife. And he's really sad about it. He really loves his drums and he wants them back, but he, being alive, can't descend into the netherworld without dying himself. There would be no way back. And at this point, he pleads to the gods to help him retrieve his drums. I mean, he's serious about getting his drums back, but they ignore him. And he even goes so far as to say that God with the capital G has forsaken him. But then his best friend, Enkidu, volunteers to descend into the netherworld to get his sacred drum back. And it's here where we are forced to wonder about the status of Enkidu. Gilgamesh can't get his own drum because he's alive, but so is Enkidu, isn't he? The text isn't really clear, and we know that previously he had died, but now he's just back being Gilgamesh's friend, who now has the ability to descend into the netherworld. Is Enkidu alive, or is he a ghost with unfinished business hanging around his friend, Gilgamesh? I'm not sure, and scholars aren't either, but it's been suggested that Enkidu here is a ghost. Either way, this is where the story gets weird, and it's also where the story gets really sad. Gilgamesh seems on board with this plan for Enkidu to descend into the netherworld to get his drum back, but he's nervous for his friend. So Gilgamesh comes up with a game plan, and he lists a bunch of things Enkidu should and shouldn't do to safely travel through the underworld. Gilgamesh says, don't wear purple or red, and don't wear makeup. They, meaning the spirits of the damned, don't like fake people. Don't take any weapons. They draw attention to yourself, and they remind the dead of their own death. Be quiet, mild, and remote. And no matter what you do, don't kiss any girls while you're there. Around you, Enkidu, the lament of the dead will whirl and scream. And after all of Gilgamesh's advice, Enkidu was prepared to enter the underworld, and he did exactly the opposite of everything Gilgamesh asked him to do. The poem goes like this. He, referring to Enkidu, wore bright clothes of celebrative red, the sight of which offended all the dead. His colored face made him seem fair and good, but spirits hate the flesh that would dare remind us of the beauty they have lost. He brought with him his club and rock and knife, and did cause strife with those whom he did mock. There too is where he showed off, where he went clothed among the naked, where he wasted food beside the starving, where he danced beside the grief-stricken. And worst of all, he kissed a girl in the netherworld. I guess he just couldn't help himself. And when Enkidu tries to come back, because he drew all of this attention to himself, he wasn't able to. The very depths of hell itself pulled him back into its abyss, and Gilgamesh was left waiting, and he never came back. Gilgamesh is once again heartbroken, but he prays to Enki, the god of knowledge, who then commands Utu Shamash, the god of the sun and justice, to bring Enkidu back to his friend Gilgamesh, up to the land of the living. And fortunately, for both of them, he does. Gilgamesh didn't get back his drum, but Enkidu returns. Whether in solid form or in ghost form, it's still unsure. Either way, Gilgamesh wept with joy that his friend had come back. And this is where we get a description from potentially the ghost of Enkidu of what the ancient Sumerian believed the afterlife or the netherworld was like. I'm going to read most of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's conversation at this point from the actual text. I'm not going to read it all, it's a lot, and I will have to paraphrase some and use a little bit of creative license because this part of the poem isn't entirely intact. But before I begin, here is a disclaimer. This story of what Enkidu saw in the afterlife is really bleak and depressing and might be triggering to some people. It's clear this narrative is intended to promote a certain cultural and moral value at the time in Sumeria. Just keep that in mind. Gilgamesh, wanting to know what the netherworld was like, asks his friend, "Did you see the order of the netherworld?" And Enkidu, with the netherworld freshly in his mind, replied, "If I tell you the order of the netherworld, sit down and weep." Gilgamesh then asks, "Did you see him who had only one son?" "I saw him. How does he fare?" "He weeps bitterly at the wooden peg which was driven into his wall." "Did you see him who had 7 sons?" "I saw him. How does he fare in the netherworld?" "As a companion of the gods, he sits on the throne and listens to judgment." "Did you see the palace eunuch?" "I saw him. How does he fare?" "Like a useless stick, he is propped in the corner." "Did you see the woman who never gave birth?" "I saw her there in the netherworld. How does she fare?" "Like a rusted pot, she is thrown away violently. She gives no man joy." "Did you see the young man who never undressed his wife?" "I saw him. How does he fare?" "You finish a rope, and he weeps over the rope." "Did you see the young woman who never undressed her husband?" "I saw her. How does she fare?" "You finish a reed mat, and she weeps over the reed mat." "Did you see him who had no heir?" "I saw him. How does he fare?" "Like him who lays bricks, he eats dust and bread." "Did you see the leprous man? He twitches like an ox as a worm eats at him." "Did you see him who fell in battle? His father and mother are not there to hold his head, and his wife weeps." "Did you see the spirit of him who has no funerary offerings? He eats the scraps and the crumbs, tossed out in the street." "Did you see him hit by the ship's board? How does he fare?" "Alas, my mother!" the man cries to her as he pulls out the ship's board. He eats its slivers. "Did you see him who was set on fire?" "I did not see him. His spirit is not about, his smoke went up to the sky." Then Gilgamesh asks his final question. "Did you see my little stillborn children who never knew existence. I saw them, and Kido replied, how do they fare? They play at a table of gold and silver, laden with honey and ghee. The tablet ends there. And if you've made it this far, comment, I can't believe it, down below in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe.